December 1944. The Hurtgen Forest is a cathedral of frozen pine and jagged iron. In the small village of Schmidt, nestled near the Siegfried Line, the air does not just carry the scent of cordite. It carries a cold so absolute it feels like a physical weight pressing against the lungs of the survivors huddling in the ruins. The ground is a tectonic plate of permafrost, and the sky is a low, slate-gray ceiling that seems to collapse into the valley. Here, inside the damp, lightless cellar of a bombed-out bakery, a dozen German civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly, listen to the world ending above them. They are wrapped in ersatz rags, thin paper-blended fabrics that have long since lost the battle against the sub-zero temperatures. Their breath comes in ragged, crystalline plumes, and their fingers are the color of blue marble. This is the hunger winter, the terminal season of a 1,000-year dream that has frozen into a nightmare. For these people, the war has ceased to be about maps or grand strategies. It is about the threshold of the skin. By late 1944, the German domestic front was a landscape of hollowed-out promises. The Third Reich, which had once boasted of its industrial superiority and the strength through joy movement, was now a shell. The German civilian was told that the coming American invader was a barbarian, a ruthless, uncultured mongrel fueled by the greed of Wall Street, who would bring nothing but rape, pillage, and the cold steel of vengeance. They expected the Americans to be as lean and desperate as the retreating Wehrmacht, driven by a scorched-earth hatred that would match the brutality of the Eastern Front. To the mother holding her shivering child in the Schmidt cellar, the rumbling in the distance was not liberation. It was the sound of a coming execution. The scale of the crisis was staggering. Across the Rhineland, coal shipments had ceased, and the electrical grid was a memory. The German garment industry, starved of wool and cotton, had resorted to spinning nettle fibers and recycled paper into clothing. These garments, when wet, became heavy, abrasive, and utterly devoid of thermal value. The population was not just defeated, they were physically diminishing, their metabolism slowing as the temperature dropped. In the silence between artillery barrages, the only sound was the chattering of teeth, a rhythmic, desperate percussion of the dying Reich. They waited for the cellar door to be kicked in, bracing for the bayonet or the scream of a conqueror. They believed the Americans would take what little they had left, stripping the very coats from their backs to fuel a vengeful advance. They did not yet understand that they were about to be confronted by something far more terrifying to the Nazi ideology than a bullet, the casual, overwhelming weight of American material abundance. The rumble grew louder, the vibrations rattling the jars of preserved sand that sat where flour once lived. The Americans were no longer a rumor. They were at the door, and with them came a logistical force the likes of which the world had never seen. The architecture of fear was built on a foundation of meticulously crafted lies. For over a decade, the German populace had been fed a diet of racial and cultural superiority, told that the Western democracies were decaying shells of nations, soft and incapable of true martial rigor. This propaganda served a dual purpose, to embolden the German soldier and to terrify the German civilian. By the winter of 1944, the rhetoric had shifted from the triumph of the new order to the necessity of total sacrifice. The Nazi leadership demanded that the people view the approaching Americans not as soldiers, but as an existential threat to the very soul of the German nation. In the towns along the Ruhr and the Rhine, the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda disseminated warnings of a Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy led by the Americans, claiming that occupation would mean the systematic starvation of the German race. This environment of manufactured dread made the reality of the German domestic collapse even more bitter. The Reich's infrastructure was a skeletal remains of its former self. While the High Command continued to move non-existent divisions on maps, the average citizen was experiencing a catastrophic failure of the social contract. The promised autarky, the state of national self-sufficiency, had proven to be a cruel mirage. The Winterhilfswerk, or winter relief of the German people, which had once collected millions in donations to provide coal and warm clothing, had redirected its resources entirely to the crumbling front lines. By the time the American 1st and 9th Armies crossed the border, the German civilian was trapped between the steel of the enemy and the vacuum of their own state's failure. The historical context of this moment is essential to understanding the psychological shock that followed. The German people were psychologically prepared for a war of annihilation. They expected the Americans to act as they would have acted, or as the SS had acted in the East. They anticipated the seizure of their remaining livestock, the burning of their homes for warmth, and the withholding of all medical and food supplies. This was the architecture of fear, a mental prison that convinced the civilian population that death by freezing or starvation was a more honorable fate than surrender to the American gangsters. However, as the American spearheads bypassed the dragon's teeth of the Siegfried Line, they brought with them a logistical tail that stretched back across the Atlantic, carrying not just munitions, but the surplus of a continent that had never known the scarcity of the Old World. The contrast was not merely military. It was a collision between a bankrupt ideology of sacrifice and the industrial reality of a nation that could afford to be merciful. The stage was set for a confrontation that would occur not with rifles, but with the simple, heavy weight of an olive-drab blanket. The expected barbarian was not a man, but a caricature, a monstrous image etched into the German psyche by years of Der Stürmer and the ministry's wireless broadcasts. In the minds of the villagers huddled in the frozen basements of the Rhineland, the American GI was a soulless mercenary, a child of a shallow and decadent culture who viewed war as a game and human life as a disposable commodity. They expected to see men with hollowed eyes and jagged tempers, reflecting the cruelty that the Nazi state had exported across Europe. This anticipation of brutality was a survival mechanism. If the enemy was a beast, then the suffering of the German people was a noble martyrdom. They gripped their few remaining possessions, a tarnished silver spoon, a tattered family Bible, believing these would be the first things snatched away by the hands of a looter. The emotional contrast between this expectation and the impending reality was a chasm of psychological proportions. While the German civilian expected a conqueror who would demand their last crust of bread, the American soldier was approaching with a logistical tale that defied the European understanding of warfare. To the German mind, conditioned by the scarcity of a war economy, everything was a zero-sum game. For one to have, another must lack. They expected the Americans to be hungry, cold, and desperate, matching the ragged state of the retreating Wehrmacht. They could not conceive of an army that did not need to steal to survive. The terror was rooted in the belief that the Americans would treat the Germans exactly as the Germans had been instructed to treat the inferior races of the East. Historical evidence from captured diaries and post-war interviews reveals the depth of this indoctrination. Civilians recounted how they had been told that American paratroopers were recruited from prisons and mental asylums, sent to wreak havoc on the innocent. This was the expected barbarian, a figure of pure, unadulterated vengeance. Yet, as the boots of the 84th Infantry Division crunched through the frozen mud of the outskirts, the sounds coming from the streets were not the screams of a massacre, but the heavy, rhythmic thrum of idling engines and the metallic clatter of crates being unloaded. The expected barbarian was arriving not with a torch to burn, but with a surplus of material that would soon make the very concept of Nazi autarky look like the primitive desperation it truly was. The first encounter was about to shatter a decade of psychological conditioning, not through a speech, but through a simple wordless act of sharing. The first contact in the village of Schmidt did not begin with a shout, but with a sound that would become the heartbeat of the occupation, the low, persistent thrum of the American GMC 2.5-ton truck. To the ears of the civilians in the cellar, this was the sound of a machine that never tired, a mechanical beast that signaled an end to the era of horse-drawn desperation. When the cellar door finally groaned open, it wasn't a bayonet that pierced the darkness, but the sharp yellow beam of a flash-lamp. The light swept over the huddle of humanity, over the frost-bitten faces of children and the trembling hands of the elderly. Then came the smell, a mixture of gasoline, strong tobacco, and something foreign yet comforting, the scent of clean, processed wool. The American soldiers who stepped into the gloom did not look like the starving, desperate wraiths of the propaganda films. They were large, encased in multiple layers of high-quality fabric, their pockets bulging with rations. One soldier, a sergeant whose face was etched with the grime of the front, looked at the shivering group and did not see enemies. He saw a logistical problem. He reached into the back of a nearby vehicle and pulled out the first of many symbols of American democracy, the M1934 olive drab wool blanket. It was thick, heavy, and carried the weight of a nation's industrial promise. As he draped the first one over the shoulders of an elderly woman, the room fell into a stunned, crystalline silence. The recurring sound of the war, the chattering of teeth, was suddenly muffled by the density of the fabric. This was the sound of plenty. It was the rustle of a surplus that the German mind could not yet compute. In the Nazi world, a blanket was a precious commodity, often stripped from the dead to keep the living barely upright. To see an American soldier casually toss a high-quality, unpatched wool blanket to a civilian was a sensory contradiction. The weight of the wool felt like an anchor, grounding the survivors in a new, confusing reality. It was not just the warmth. It was the tactile evidence of an economy so vast that it could clothe its enemies better than the Reich could clothe its own master race. The civilians clutched the rough material to their faces, the smell of the American quartermaster corps filling their lungs, replacing the scent of damp rot and defeat. The transition was jarring. Expecting the sharp edge of a blade, they instead felt the heavy, scratchy embrace of an abundance they had been told did not exist. Every movement of the soldiers, the clatter of their gear, the casual way they leaned against the ruins, suggested a confidence born of limitless supply. This was the true shock of the encounter, the realization that the Americans were not fighting for survival, but were managing a surplus. As more blankets were brought down from the trucks, the cellar transformed from a tomb into a sanctuary of olive drab wool. The propaganda of the expected barbarian began to unravel with every inch of fabric shared, replaced by the overwhelming, silent testimony of American logistics. The sound of the idling trucks outside was no longer a threat. It was the hum of a superpower that had arrived to redefine the meaning of victory through the simple, heavy weight of a blanket. The factual reality of the American advance was a statistical marvel that far exceeded the wildest fever dreams of European industrialism. While the German war machine had prided itself on the precision of its engineering, it had ultimately been strangled by the limitations of its resources. In contrast, the United States was operating on a scale that was mathematically incomprehensible to the civilians of the Rhineland. By late 1944, the U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps was managing a supply chain that moved over 500,000 tons of supplies across the European continent every month. This was the Red Ball Express and its successors, a logistical pulse that beat with the rhythm of thousands of factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago. For every German soldier shivering in a foxhole with a single threadbare coat, the American military was equipped with a multi-layered clothing system designed for the most extreme conditions. The disparity was most evident in the specific data of cold weather gear. The U.S. Army had procured over 25 million wool blankets during the course of the war. These were not merely pieces of bedding. They were engineered survival tools, woven with a density of 100% virgin wool, weighing nearly 4 pounds each. To a German civilian, who by 1944 was lucky to possess a blanket made of reclaimed cellulose and rabbit hair, the arrival of a single crate of American blankets represented more warmth than an entire village had seen in years. This was the physical manifestation of the arsenal of democracy. It was a war of numbers where the American side had simply decided that no soldier, and, as it turned out, many civilians, would be allowed to freeze. Documented records from the period highlight the sheer volume of this generosity. Military government units following the combat troops were often authorized to release Class II supplies, items like clothing and bedding, to prevent mass casualty events among the displaced civilian populations. In the sector held by the 9th Infantry Division, reports indicated that within 48 hours of capturing a town, supply officers were often distributing thousands of these heavy wool blankets to local hospitals and shelters. The American logistical doctrine was predicated on the idea of overstrength supply. They brought more than they could ever need, allowing for a margin of mercy that the German military could never afford. This factual reality created a profound disconnect in the minds of the occupied. They watched as American soldiers used these high-quality blankets as ground cloths for their vehicles or padding for their crates. Objects that the Germans considered treasures were treated as utilitarian disposables by the Americans. This casual relationship with material wealth was the most potent propaganda the United States possessed. It proved that the American system of production and freedom had not just won the war on the battlefield, but had rendered the entire Nazi economic theory obsolete. The weight of the olive drab blanket was not just the weight of wool. It was the weight of a factual, industrial superiority that was now being used to preserve the very lives the Reich had abandoned to the cold. The data of American production was no longer an abstract figure in a newspaper. It was a tangible, heavy warmth draped over the shoulders of the starving. The central cinematic moment occurred not through a formal decree, but through a singular, weary gesture of humanity. In a frost-slicked courtyard near the town of Aachen, a young American GI stood guard over a group of newly displaced refugees. He was a man who had seen the carnage of the forest, whose friends were buried in the mud of the Siegfried Line, and who had every reason to harbor a cold, professional indifference toward the people of the nation that had started the conflagration. The non-fraternization orders were strict. The American soldier was instructed not to speak to, sympathize with, or assist the German populace. They were the enemy, and the war was still very much alive. Yet, as he watched an elderly woman collapse into the slush, her body racked by the violent tremors of advanced hypothermia, the military hierarchy vanished. The soldier did not look for a superior's permission. He reached up to his own pack, unstrapped his personal M1934 wool blanket, the very one he relied upon for his own survival in the foxholes, and draped it over the woman's shoulders. It was a gesture that defied the gravity of the entire war. For the German civilians watching from the periphery, this was a moment of profound cognitive dissonance. They had been told for years that the American was a counter-terrorist, a man of no heart who sought only to humiliate the German people. Instead, they witnessed an act of sacrificial kindness that was entirely unprovoked. The soldier did not ask for thanks. He did not even look the woman in the eye. He simply returned to his post, his breath hitching in the cold, now one layer less protected against the winter wind. This gesture was a radical departure from the total war ideology they had lived under. In the Nazi system, kindness was a weakness, and resources were only for those who could still fight for the Führer. To see a soldier give away his own warmth to a defeated enemy was a subversion of everything they understood about power. The blanket itself, thick and heavy with the scent of American industrial soap, became a physical barrier between the woman and the grave. It was a silent refutation of Goebbels' propaganda. This single act, repeated in thousand-fold variations across the front, served as the true opening salvo of the post-war era. It was the moment the civilian population realized that the Americans had brought with them a moral surplus that matched their material one. The psychological impact of the gesture cannot be overstated. It transformed the American soldier from a faceless invader into a human being capable of empathy. For the German mother clutching her child, or the old man leaning on his cane, the sight of that olive drab wool being shared was a sign that the world might not be ending after all. It suggested that there was a way back from the abyss, a path toward a future that was not defined by racial struggle or scarcity, but by the simple, quiet dignity of helping another person survive the night. The heavy wool was no longer just a piece of equipment. It was a promise. As the word of these small mercies spread through the whispers of the occupied towns, The ideological grip of the Reich began to slip, replaced by the warmth of a shared, democratic abundance. The ideological rupture was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, quiet collapse of certainty. For 12 years, the German people had been told that their system was the only one capable of providing order and security, yet they stood amidst the smoking ruins of that promise, shivering in the dark. When the American soldiers began distributing blankets, it triggered a profound psychological crisis. The civilian population had to reconcile the image of the decadent, weak American with the reality of the healthy, well-equipped, and remarkably generous men standing before them. This was the failure of the master race narrative in real time. If the Americans were as inferior as Goebbels had claimed, how could they possess such an inexhaustible supply of high-quality wool? How could they afford to clothe their enemies while the German state had left its own people to freeze? This realization shattered the foundation of Nazi loyalty. The ideological grip of the Reich relied on the idea of shared sacrifice and the necessity of struggle against a hostile world. The casual abundance of the American military rendered this struggle meaningless. It became clear that the scarcity of the German home front was not an inevitable consequence of war, but a direct result of a failed ideology. The olive drab blanket became a visual and tactile refutation of everything they had been taught. It represented a world where production was not a tool for conquest, but a means to provide for human needs. The civilians clutching these blankets were experiencing a shift in their understanding of the world. They were seeing, for the first time, that democracy was not a sign of weakness, but a source of immense, restorative power. Historical accounts from the occupation of the Rhineland describe a strange, somber mood that settled over the liberated towns. It was a mixture of profound relief and a crushing sense of betrayal by their own leaders. The civilians began to look at the American logistics, the endless convoys of trucks, the mountains of crates, the organized distribution of aid, as a glimpse into a future they had been denied. The rupture was total. The fear of the invader was replaced by a burgeoning curiosity about the system that could produce such wealth and such an unexpected moral compass. By sharing their blankets, the Americans had done more than save lives. They had dismantled the psychological walls of the Third Reich, proving that the most effective weapon against a hateful ideology was the simple, undeniable evidence of a better way of life. This ideological collapse was the prerequisite for the reconstruction of Germany, a necessary clearing of the mind before the building of a new, democratic state could begin. The symbolic weight of the blanket went far beyond its physical mass. In the cold, gray light of the Rhineland winter, the American M1934 wool blanket became a recurring icon of a different kind of civilization. It was a dense, scratchy, and unyielding piece of fabric, yet to the German civilian it felt like the softest silk. It was a weapon of peace, woven in the looms of New England and the Midwest, representing an industrial engine that could pivot from building tanks to crafting comfort without missing a beat. The blanket was a tangible piece of the American dream, heavy enough to block out the draft of a shattered window, and durable enough to survive the grit of a foxhole. It stood in stark contrast to the ersatz philosophy of the Nazi state, which had spent years trying to convince its people that scarcity was a virtue and that substitute materials were a sign of national ingenuity. To hold the American wool was to hold the truth. The Reich's fabric was thin, brittle, and prone to disintegrating when wet. It was a metaphor for the ideology that produced it, grand in appearance but hollow and fragile under pressure. The American blanket, by contrast, was honest. It was thick because the sheep existed, it was warm because the factories were efficient, it was available because the sea lanes were open. Every time an American GI draped one of these olive-drab rectangles over a shivering child, he was delivering a silent lecture on the merits of a free market democracy. The blanket didn't care about the pedigree of the person it warmed. It didn't ask for an oath of loyalty. It simply performed its function, providing a barrier against the cruelty of nature that the German state had failed to provide. This recurring symbol of abundance became a constant presence in the lives of the occupied. As the front moved further into the heart of Germany, the blankets remained behind, left in the hands of families who would use them for years to come. They were cut down to make coats for children, used as curtains to hide the ruins of a home, and passed down as heirlooms of a time when the world was reborn in the cold. The sound of the wool, the heavy, muffled thud when a folded stack was dropped onto a table, became the sound of security. It was the sound of a superpower that did not need to be cruel to be strong. The weight of the wool was the weight of a nation that believed in the value of the individual, proving that the greatest strength of democracy was not its ability to destroy, but its capacity to provide. Through this simple object, the narrative of American barbarism was permanently replaced by the reality of American benevolence, a warmth that would linger long after the last fires of the war had been extinguished. The transition from the chaos of the front line to the organized efforts of civil affairs units marked the beginning of a transformation that reached far beyond the immediate battlefield. In the weeks following the initial contact, the distribution of blankets and cold weather gear shifted from the impulsive acts of individual GIs to a massive, military-led humanitarian operation. This was the moment when the American logistical engine proved it could do more than fuel an invasion. It could stabilize a collapsing civilization. Thousands of these heavy, olive-drab blankets were funneled into makeshift hospitals, orphanages, and refugee camps. For many Germans, this was their first encounter with the concept of a state that possessed a surplus of compassion. The presence of the blankets in these civilian spaces served as a constant, silent reminder that the war they had been fighting was fundamentally different from the one the Americans were finishing. The impact was measurable in the sudden shift of civilian cooperation. In towns where the American quartermaster had established distribution points, the anticipated resistance and sabotage by werewolf partisans largely failed to materialize. It is difficult to maintain a commitment to a suicidal ideology when the supposed enemy is busy wrapping your children in high-quality wool. This period saw the birth of a new German perception of the West, one rooted in the tangible reality of American support. The blankets became the first building blocks of a new social order. They were used to partition living spaces in crowded ruins, providing the first semblance of privacy and dignity many had known in years. This logistical mercy provided a psychological buffer, allowing the population to move past the shock of defeat and begin the grueling work of self-reflection. Documented accounts from the era reveal how these simple acts of sharing fundamentally altered the German internal dialogue. The letters and journals of the time are filled with expressions of disbelief at the American lack of bitterness. The German people had expected to be treated as pariahs. Instead, they were treated as a logistical responsibility. This shift was critical for the success of the later Marshall Plan. It established a baseline of trust that the Americans were a people of their word, and that their abundance was something they were willing to share to ensure a stable, peaceful Europe. The heavy wool blanket, once a mere piece of army equipment, had become a diplomatic instrument of the highest order. It paved the way for the reconstruction of a nation by proving that the American system was not interested in the annihilation of its enemies, but in the restoration of their humanity. The long-term legacy of this period was the realization that the most effective way to defeat a hateful ideology was not just to outproduce it, but to outgive it, turning the tools of war into the foundation for a lasting and prosperous peace. The epilogue of this winter tale is not written in the ink of treaties, but in the fibers of the wool that remains. As the spring of 1945 finally breathed life back into the frozen valleys of the Rhineland, the olive-drab blankets did not disappear. They stayed in the homes of the people, draped over the beds of children who would grow up to build a new Germany, and stored in trunks as reminders of the moment the world shifted on its axis. The blanket had performed a feat that no artillery barrage could accomplish. It had provided the warmth necessary for the heart to thaw. It stood as a final poetic reflection on the nature of power. True strength, it seemed, was not found in the ability to demand a world of ice and sacrifice, but in the capacity to offer a world of warmth and abundance. In the grand theater of human history, Ideologies often perish when they are confronted by the undeniable evidence of their own poverty. The Nazi state had promised glory but delivered a hollow, shivering cold. The American democracy, for all its flaws, had arrived with a surplus of material and moral weight that rendered the new order obsolete. The heavy wool was a bridge across an abyss of hatred, a simple, scratchy testimony to the idea that freedom is not just an abstract principle, but a system that produces enough to share with its enemies. It proved that a nation built on the dignity of the individual and the power of industry could afford to be the shepherd of its defeated foes. Ultimately, the story of the blankets is a story about the triumph of light over shadow. It is a reminder that in the darkest winters of the human soul, the most revolutionary act is one of simple, quiet generosity. The abundance of the American spirit, symbolized by that thick olive-drab fabric, became the foundation for a peace that has endured for generations. It taught a broken people that they were not forgotten by the world, and that the path to the future was paved with the same heavy wool that had kept them alive when their own leaders had left them to die. The blanket remains a silent witness to a larger truth, that the greatest victory is not the one that conquers the land, but the one that preserves the human spirit through the simple, overwhelming weight of a shared humanity. In the end, the warmth of a single blanket was enough to begin the long, slow work of healing a continent, proving that mercy is the true architecture of a lasting freedom.